Fighting 17, the Jolly Rogers, offers a close look at one of the most storied fighter squadrons in U.S. naval aviation history, VF-17, known as the Jolly Rogers. Formed during World War II, the squadron quickly gained a reputation for its fierce combat record and its distinctive skull and crossbones insignia, a symbol that would become iconic in military aviation. Flying the powerful Vought F-4U Corsair, an aircraft as challenging to land as it was formidable in the air, the pilots of VF-17 were among the first Navy squadrons to bring the Corsair into frontline combat. Operating in the Pacific Theater, they engaged in intense aerial battles against Japanese forces, often under difficult and dangerous conditions. But beyond the statistics and victories, this documentary captures something more personal, the experience of the pilots themselves. Many were in their early 20s, navigating not only the technical demands of combat aviation, but also the psychological weight of war. The camaraderie, skill, and resilience played a critical role in the squadron's success. VF-17's story is also marked by a certain independence. Due to early concerns about carrier landings, the squadron operated primarily from land bases, an unusual arrangement for a Navy fighter unit at the time. Despite these challenges, they achieved one of the highest kill-to-loss ratios in the Pacific, cementing their place in aviation history. As with many wartime accounts, their legacy is complex, defined by bravery and innovation, but also by the realities and costs of combat. As you watch, consider not only the tactical achievements of the Jolly Rogers, but the human stories behind them, the risks they took, the bonds they formed, and the mark they left on history. Enjoy Fighting 17, the Jolly Rogers.
My time in VF-17 was one of the most exciting and rewarding times of my life. It was very stressful, and there was a lot of grief mixed in with the joy and the pride. And at times I was sorely pressed to keep ahead of these guys and turn in a good enough performance so that I was leading them instead of them leading me.
I've often thought how lucky it was that I was assigned to VF-17. They were a bunch of free-spirited, high-spirited pilots. The skipper taught us discipline, and through his leadership and inspiration, he turned that group into a deadly fighting machine that made records in the Pacific.
The squadron had a dual mission: protect American bombers and confront the immense Japanese Imperial Air Force based at Rabaul. Guadalcanal had now been won, but the next link in the island chain was vital to repulse the Japanese threat to Australia and New Zealand. The Allied Air Command needed to capture Bougainville to establish an air base from which Rabaul could be hit. The 42 pilots and 42 planes of Fighting 17, 5 days on the scene, were thrown into the action.
And then on the 1st of November, the 1st Marine Division and the 37th Army Division were making a landing on Bougainville. There were over 100,000 Japanese sitting there on the islands waiting for anybody that might come.
I had a flight of 8 Corsairs as part of the combat air patrol over Empress Augusta Bay. I spotted the enemy flight off to the northeast from us, distance about 25 miles.
I swung out west to get up sun from them, and as I got closer, I saw that red meatball on the wings of one of those babies, and I said, by God, this is it. We're here. Now we can get a little revenge for what these guys have been doing to our shipmates.
As we got within about a mile, coming in 30 degrees off their course, in approximately this type position, the Jap fighter leader spotted us and honked around as tight a turn as he could to counter our attack. And I fired at him, and as far as I could tell, I didn't hit him.
Now, I opened fire using as a point of aim the intersection of the wing root and the fuselage of this Jap plane when his wingspan filled 50 mils in my gun sight. I pressed that trigger maybe 2 seconds, and whoosh, he went up in a ball of fire.
I was up with Raj and his 4, and then Paul Cordray was supposed to have his 4, but only 2 of us were there. I mean, 1 besides Paul, and that was me. So instead of having 8, we had 6. And they took and busted Raj on a vector. They had bogies coming in, and he tore out there to beat the band, and there was a whole raft of them coming. As soon as they said buster, I thought, oh my God, here we go. It gets a little bit twitchy, as they say. You tend to make a donut out of your parachute, you know what I mean? It's a little tightening. Well, Paul was on him and was diving, and he overran him. Then I jumped over and got on him, and he caught on fire and went on down him.
I turned and went back into the mad scramble of airplanes and picked up a 0 and bored in on him to point-blank range. When he blew up, I was close enough that I got gasoline and hydraulic fluid on my windshield of my airplane. When I got that first flamer, the sensation was almost identical with the first piece of ass.
There is nothing more exciting or thrilling than aerial combat, where you kill the enemy pilot before he can kill you. It's not like a ball game where if you lose, you can play again tomorrow. If you lose in this arena, there is no tomorrow.
But on the way back, we flew over the water and we're going to fly into a little harbor. And the whole group of us flew low on the water and popped over a ridge and down into the bay where we thought perhaps would be some barges. And we went in to strafe the whole harbor, and all hell broke loose. The anti-aircraft fire was so heavy, it was black and just like a carpet. I saw something on the shore. I turned aside and went over and strafed that. And while I was off the line and came back and joined on Johnny Keitho, he'd been hit by shrapnel. So we retired for a ways. The engine will run for a minute or 2, and we got out of the harbor and out several miles at sea. And his engine froze up and he had to land in the water. Well, the airplane was loaded with ammunition almost and was going down fast. So when he was on the wing reaching for his equipment, his survival gear in his boat, that canopy was still in the way and he couldn't get it out in time, and this plane sank and left him in the water with just his life jacket in shark water and 2 miles off the beach of a Japanese occupied island. So I lost my best friend the first day. I thought it was going to be a long, long war if you lose a casualty like that the first day. And you just have to go forward.
Ten months earlier, the young pilots who would go forward met for the first time at Norfolk, Virginia. They were assembled by their new skipper, Tom Blackburn. Two tasks faced Blackburn and his executive officer, Roger Hedrick: to find men with an instinct for fighting and train them endlessly to fly off carriers.
We were trying to meld a team of rugged individuals where we had a team that instinctively would react to enemy, certain conditions, positions even in aerial combat, so that each member of this team knew that he could count on the other one, knew what to expect of the other one.
The squadron trained at Norfolk for 3 months before moving to Manteo, North Carolina for gunnery practice. They had already developed a distinctive personality enhanced by their skull and crossbones insignia. Now they met their plane and fell in love with it.
This was a new chance-bought Corsair, and we were all greatly impressed and thrilled with the fact that here we were flying something much faster than anything we'd been in prior to that time. And being an old firefighter myself, I knew that speed was the number one thing I wanted in anything that I was going into combat with.
In a final approach to an aircraft carrier landing, it was really difficult to see the landing signal officer. And that big snout led us to start affectionately referring to it as a hog, and of course the leader was a big hog.
Blackburn stressed discipline in the air. He wanted teamwork and knew exactly what it took. He was a tough taskmaster, yet he possessed a tolerance of the idiosyncrasies of his men, and the reputation of Blackburn's irregulars grew.
My hometown of Beaufort, North Carolina, is right on the ocean, about 100 miles south of Manteo. So I went buzzing down along the coast at low altitude, came in through the Beaufort Channel, heading across the bay right towards the front porch of my home, which was on the waterfront there. Flew right over the top of the house as low and as fast as I could go, then down the front street of the town, right over the top of the buildings. My father came out of the building. I was wiggling my wings, and he was waving. I went back. My mother was in the front yard. I made a simulated, modified dive-bombing run on her and had her running for the front porch.
And we did get a reputation for being a pretty rowdy bunch, I'm afraid.
I suppose I was kind of soft-hearted or soft-headed with my guys. The reason I condoned and encouraged overly aggressive behavior was that this was what was going to be required in a combat situation.
We had the best skipper, fighter skipper in the Navy, and maybe in the war. We had the best fighter plane of World War II, and with skipper, worked us so hard, if you can call it work. He stressed gunnery, and we were on gunnery hops every day in training, and sometimes 2 and 3 times a day. He worked so hard at that we had to get good.
You have to have a hell of a big ego. He has to come on strong and have a lot of self-confidence, because he's basically a loner, and it's his own skills and his own intelligence that mean the difference between his living or not living.
By October 1943, the Jolly Rogers were ready. Based at Onondaga, New Georgia, with 10 days of combat behind them, the squadron awaited their next challenge. The next link in the island chain was Bougainville, only 250 miles from Fortress Rabaul. A Marine invasion force would hit the island at Torquay. For Fighting 17, the big test had begun. The Battle of the Solomon Sea was about to take place.
On the 9th of November, my Air Combat Intelligence Officer, Duke Henning, and I were summoned to the Fighter Command at Munda. We had a briefing with Commander Aircraft Solomons, who was then Major General Twining, U.S. Air Force. The Japanese were assembling a strong surface force at Rabaul, and it was a very grave threat to the landing force at Torquay.
Rabaul being out of the range of our bases at Onondaga at the time, none of our planes could get to Rabaul and get back home. So a task force was sent in.
Operating off the carriers Essex and Bunker Hill, the squadron's mission was to provide cover for the carriers while their squadrons escorted bombers to Rabaul.
We flew out early morning darkness through rain squalls to rendezvous with a carrier task force of the Bunker Hill, the Essex, and the Independence, and 9 destroyers who were steaming towards the giant base at Rabaul to launch a strike by their air groups on Rabaul.
We circled overhead and watched while they launched the strikes from those 3 carriers. We were well aware of the fact that as we landed aboard ship that we were there for one reason, to protect this task force from what was going to be a large raid coming in by the Japanese from Rabaul. And they were going to do everything they could. Here they had apparently an opportunity to get 3 of our carriers, and so we knew that we could expect everything they could throw at us would be coming our way shortly.
It was the most exciting thing I'd ever seen. Planes were diving and climbing and turning and twisting all over the sky. There was tracer bullets and the black puffs of anti-aircraft fire from our ships. Japanese planes were going down in flames and hitting the water in a pool of flames. It was a free-for-all, just a survival of the fittest.
The flight control officer on the ship knows who's up there and where, and he would vector us out. They'd pick them up way out, and we're supposed to get them before they get to the carrier, because there was a single fighter coming in. And finally we see him, we all duck down, and Jim Strike happened to be leading it, and we followed him all the way down to the water, and then finally he shot, and the guy blew up. And then we had to climb like heck, because by that time there's jillions of them coming out, you know, after us. And it got so bad that it was up for grabs, because you didn't have to be vectored. They're already in sight, and we were after them.
We were soon split up into small groups, shooting down planes. I got 1 confirmed and a couple damaged and probables.
I suddenly saw this Kate torpedo bomber making a run towards the Bunker Hill. I went into a high-speed dive approaching from the left rear, and as I approached the plane, I can see the rear seat gunner firing tracer bullets at me. But by that time, my 50 caliber bullets was hitting the Jap plane. It burst into flames, slowly rolled upside down, and went into the water. I was engulfed in a wave of euphoria. I yelled with excitement, sort of a modern version of the famed rebel yell heard at Gettysburg.
What I saw was groups of Japanese aircraft emerging from both sides of a huge thunderhead. It consisted of about 40 Jap fighters covering what looked to be 25 to 30 dive bombers. So I set up on the leader of the Japanese fighter flight, feeling if I could knock him down, this would be a maximum disorganization. Unfortunately, he saw me coming early enough, so he dove out, and I got sucked into following him. I couldn't catch him, and he pulled into a cloud, and I leveled out at around 3,000 feet. I'd lost my wingman in the process, and the windshield and canopy were so cold from the altitude that they fogged over just absolutely solid. So I ducked into a cloud to give the glassware a chance to warm up. And once that had happened, I stuck my nose out of the cloud again. A flight of 6 Japanese Tonys who had seen me come out of the cloud. The flight leader was rocking his wings and starting into a dive for me, mighty close. I was terrified. I expected to be killed any minute. I honked, played around as tight as I could, got back into the cloud. I really expected that he'd nail me. So I came out of the cloud, and as I did so, I saw two Corsairs, and the lead Corsair's guns opened up.
I spotted one Jap, Zeke, a lone guy trying to get back to Rabaul. And I took after him, and just as I got in the firing position, he was into a big cloud. I chased him into another one. Out he came, chased him back. I thought he was coming out again. And it was a full deflection shot. Plane was coming out, crossing my bow up ahead. I was squeezing the trigger. My God, that's a hog.
It was a beautiful shot. 3 bullets through the accessory section, and 3 behind the armor plate, just back of the seat.
Lo and behold, who's in this plane and what plane is it? A big hog, Tommy Blackburn. And old Tommy's giving me this old, hey, you lousy shot, you know. And thank God I was a lousy shot.
Finally, my gas gauge told me it was time to head back to base. Shortly, I saw that I was using fuel more rapidly than I should have been. I was afraid that I'd been hit and was leaking fuel. So I decided to change course and head for Treasury Island. I made all my preparations for ditching. I thought, kid, let's don't foul this up because you only get one chance. I was approaching from the northern end, heading south. We didn't know how far the New Zealand troops had pushed north against the Japs. I hit a couple hundred yards off the coast, about midway down the island. I got out of my plane, paddled away, and the plane sank in about 20 seconds, completely underwater. When you ditch a plane, you immediately execute that most famous of all military maneuvers known as, let's get the hell out of here. And that's exactly what I did. I got in my raft, and I saw a ragged-looking fella come out of the bushes on the shore line. It was a kind of a rocky coral cliff there. And my heart near about skipped a beat because when I first saw him, I thought it was a Jap. But then I saw it was a white man, and he started semaphoring just with his hands. And he semaphored, help is on the way.
Ensign Hill made it back to Ondango. 60 Japanese aircraft weren't so lucky. VF-17 posted 18.5 kills with no losses. The carriers were not damaged. The defeat in the Solomons stunned the Japanese. They withdrew their warships from Rabaul, allowing the United States to build an airstrip on Bougainville. While the new airstrip was constructed, the squadron received 2 weeks rest and recreation in Australia. The Australians, rescued from the Japanese onslaught, gave the squadron a very warm welcome.
The people were exceedingly friendly. I remember vividly that the Australia Hotel, we used the term snake pit once or twice up in the States. I was bunking with Lem Cook in the apartment we had in the high-rise overlooking Sydney Harbor. But as we stepped out of the hotel, lo and behold, here were 2 young ladies walking in. They looked very attractive to us, so we did a 180 and followed them in.
And we go down to the, what the heck is it, the big hotel. They tell me it's down now, Sydney Hotel. And there'd be 10 or 12 of us in there and drinking beer, and we run them out of beer, and so we said, how about some ale? And they said, yeah, we got ale.
After a couple of days of nonstop, round-the-clock parties with various girls, I was going to take an afternoon off and relax and go to this musical show they were having in Sydney. This young lady who was the female star of the show came out on the stage. When I saw her, I was smitten.
And we had a wonderful time that evening, dancing and so forth. And then it seems to me, as I recall, they decided that they could come in and perhaps help us cook a meal now and then, which they did.
So we ended up running them out of ale, and they said, did you ever try, what the heck's the other stuff? It's more potent, it tastes like vinegar.
After the show was over, I go to the stage door, slipped the old guy on the door some money, got him to take a message up to the young lady saying I would like to take her to dinner that evening. The word came back that she had, thank you very much, but she had a date for that evening. Well, I wasn't about to be shot down in flames that easily, so I sent another message back up saying I would like to just meet you and tell you how much I had enjoyed your performance. Well, what performer can resist something like that, you know, a compliment?
These two girls came out in nothing but panties on, lined up arm to arm, just as if they were in a chorus line. Them and I were in the sack trying to sleep in and catch up on some sleep. And they wanted us to get up and go out to the horse races or some stupid thing. But here they come, and believe me, they got our attention.
Stout. They bring the stout. And they said you're supposed to put half stout and half beer, and it makes a great drink. Well, we had no beer, no ale, and only the stout, and that kind of broke up the party.
I introduced myself. I turned on all the charm that I possessed. I pulled out all stops. In a little while, she smiled at me and she said, well, I have a date for this afternoon, but would you like to meet me here tomorrow afternoon?
Well, my friends were different than me. They got lucky.
The next afternoon, I was there with an armful of roses, just like I had seen Clark Gable do in the movies when he was romancing somebody. I had a taxi outside with a taxi driver standing there to holding the door open for us. We got in, went up to our apartment, had a few drinks, got to know each other, cooked a few steaks for supper. Well, this became kind of our daily routine. When I got back to Espiritu Santo, I purchased the latest issue of Yank magazine, turned to see who the pinup girl was. And lo and behold, there smiling at me was this lovely girl I had just kissed goodbye in Sydney.
And I recall further once we were in a restaurant, just to show again how these people appreciated what Americans were doing for them. While we were eating, of course, we were in old khakis, and we had this hair that had been clipped by that barber as we crossed the line. So we were pretty scraggly-looking characters, but the people near us were really interested in us and looking at us. I assumed to myself, waiting to ask us something. They didn't have the nerve, I guess, or didn't want to interfere with us, but I finally stood up. And I looked at all of them, I said, folks, we're winning. And as you can see, that affected me because they started applauding us. And that was a big help for our morale, too.
Roger Hedrick's optimism soon encountered reality. By January 1944, the Bougainville airstrip was ready, extending the reach of the American air assault. Most of the island was still occupied by the enemy, and Fighting 17 would now face its greatest challenge, flying missions over Rabaul.
The fighting starting the 26th of January was an entirely different character than we'd had before, and it was a hell of a sight more hazardous. In the previous activities, flying over Empress Augusta Bay and the carriers, we had been the hunters, and when we went into Rabaul, we were the hunted.
By the time we took off, it was a 225-mile trip over to Rabaul. En route, the Japanese on the island behind us at Bougainville would radio over to their friends at Rabaul, telling them exactly, I guess, how many planes that were coming. We could see the dust clouds rolling up off of these fields as their planes took off to get up, climb above us. On the first tally-ho of each flight, somebody would see a bandit. Bandit's high at 11 o'clock. That's when all your aches and pains disappeared. The oxygen mask would quit cutting into your face, and your fanny, the ache that you had there from sitting on your emergency rations and the can sticking up and jabbing you, you thought that was gone, wiped completely out of your mind in a flash, and your only thought was, I've got one job to do, and that's to get that guy before he gets me or gets to the bombers.
And we'd go up and challenge them with over 100 airplanes every day. We'd get there about 11 o'clock in the morning, as I remember. And there'd be a great big dogfight right up there over the harbor at Rabaul. When we were escorting the bombers in and they were making their attacks, there's a period where you have to reverse course, and that turnaround was kind of technically difficult. And the Japanese were very smart about waiting for that time when you had to try to make this big turn. And those that are on the outside of the turn were very vulnerable to being picked off by the Japanese fighters. I remember one occasion when I just about didn't get home because I was on that turn, and I happened to glance up into the sun, and here was a vertically diving Zero that had me right in his sights. I jerked on the stick, tried to bring my guns up to bear on him first, and realized that if I got my guns to bear, that his engine and mine were going to become one. So as it happened, I pushed the stick forward just a little bit, and we passed each other vertically, me going up and him going down. And I don't think the width of this room was any farther apart than the two airplanes.
When we went into Rabaul from Bougainville, we lost 2 people on the first day and 2 more shot down, and for across the next 10 days, the average was 1 pilot per day. And our tour was supposed to be 42 days, and we started with 42 pilots, and it wasn't too tough to figure out what the percentages were. When Teeth Burris was shot down, I saw the Jap making the run on him. Teeth's wingman wasn't covering him properly. I tried to alert Teeth to break and get out of this situation, and I don't think he heard me, but anyway, I saw his plane get hit and saw him going down, and I had no way of knowing whether he was alive or dead, but I knew he was at least going to have to ditch in enemy territory. And it was very tough to take because everybody loved and respected Burris. He was a very brave and a very able guy.
We lost people over Rabaul in parachutes, so we know they went down alive, but we never saw them or heard tell of them again.
We flew an escort mission for SPDs and TBFs over Lacuna Airfield, Rabaul, flying tail end Charlie and Rogers Division at high cover at about 19,000 feet. We were jumped by 8 Jap fighters. I turned violently to the right to avoid one and nearly ran head on into another one that just passed right over the top of me. A second later, my plane shuddered with the force of an explosion. My controls were useless. I fell off into a diving turn. The cockpit filled with smoke. I thought I was on fire. I got a hold of the canopy release handle and started to open it and bail out, and my hand froze on the handle. But I'm falling through the air and fighting, and the plane would go down, and then it would flip and come up. And finally, though, after falling about a mile through the air, I began to regain control. I leveled off at about 3,000 feet so that I would have enough room to bail out if I lost control of the plane. I looked back and I could see the left aileron was shot away, part of the tail was gone, the horizontal stabilizer was flapping in the breeze, and I headed back alone towards Bougainville, about 150 miles away. When I put the flaps down, the nose would start sinking. So I thought I could go over to the bomber strip, which was longer, come in and make a flat, high-speed approach with no flaps and kind of grease it down on the runway. So I'm going along fine just above the runway, but I'm floating along, and I've got to take off a little bit of power. And when I did, the nose dropped, and the last thing I remember, the plane is up like that, and I'm going over on my back. So I went over, the plane went upside down, skidding tail first down the runway at 125 knots and demolished the set. They took me to the hospital, sewed up the back of my head with 30-some stitches in my head, and I stayed in the hospital a week.
It was a difficult thing to do, to get back up again for the next morning and be ready to go and feel like you're combat ready after having had recent combat experience, having maybe experienced a loss. When they say you have combat fatigue, it's true. Every person has their own threshold.
It's an amazing feeling to be totally relaxed and trying to get to sleep. And I guess your mind is so stirred up, you know, from combat and all, that I just couldn't do it. But I take a few snorts and, hey, I can go to sleep like a baby. So I think that encouraged a lot of us to get to drink more than we would normally.
For over a month, the combat went on, day after pulverizing day. It took its toll on minds and men.
Late in the afternoon, there had been an erroneous report that a Jap carrier was coming into Rabaul, and the Strike Command and Fighter Command launched everything they could get their hands on. My wingman, Gutenkunst, and I came in at high altitude and did some very effective fighting. But when we came back to Bougainville, we got back, it was dark, and there were a lot of airplanes that had been shot up in this action, and our own strip was closed because of several wrecks being pulled off the runway. So all the dive bombers and torpedo planes and fighters were trying to land at the bomber strip, and it was utter chaos. I landed without incident, but as I was rolling out, I looked back, or I looked in my mirrors actually, to be sure it was clear behind me so I could turn off, and I saw this fireball at the downwind end of the runway. Gutenkunst was making a regular turning approach into the field, and a Marine Major, Johnson, who had been badly shot up and was wounded, and had no hydraulics in his plane and no radio, was making the straight-in approach. They collided right over the end of the strip, and both of them were killed. I was extremely close to Gutenkunst, and he and I had been through quite a lot together, and both playing on the beach and combat action, and I regarded him as a younger brother, of whom I was very fond, and I was really crushed when he got killed in this freak accident. I was having a hard time emotionally with these losses.
My dear Mrs. Gutenkunst, my heart is truly heavy and the tears are welling as I force myself to try to write. Your son Doug was more than among the best of the distinguished group of brave. Helping to achieve that victory, we pledge that your son shall not have died in vain. Sincerely, Tom Blackburn.
Fighting 17 had not lost a single bomber, but their own losses were alarming. A new strategy was desperately needed. Blackburn, Hedrick, and others hatched a new tactic. They called it roving high cover.
If we had 16 planes assigned to a mission and we had, say, 20 in an up condition that could fly, then 4 who weren't on the mission could take these 4, take off ahead of the boys that are going on the strike, and be over the target about 32,000 feet, waiting for the bombers to come up. And we had no duties. We didn't have to cover bombers or anything.
We went in forward, and we stayed with the bombers and slightly behind them as we approached Rabaul, so the radar wouldn't detect two groups. And as we got closer, then I speeded up, and we climbed as rapidly as we could to get up to an altitude of about 30,000 feet. So I went along, we spotted 12 Zeeks, I think, in one group, and we dove on. And we were able, with our speed, to continue the altitude advantage, coming back for the runs on, and they had been caught completely by surprise. I think I got 3 that day, and the other fellows probably got at least 4 more. One other occasion, and this sight I'll never forget, I was down in low cover this time, but we had sent one division ahead under Ike Kepford, who ended up our leading ace, to go in on roving patrol again. I was leading our flight at that time, and I looked up, and I saw 2 planes, just mammoth torches, with a straight dive coming down side by side, almost as if they were in formation. And I'll be darned, a minute or 2 later, here came 2 more, followed by 2 more again, all torching, both of them, each time. And finally, the final 2 came down for a total of 8 planes. This was a marvelous innovation, a fighter sweep, which we called roving patrol, probably the greatest tactics that Tom, in my mind, was able to develop while we were out there.
The aerial siege of Rabaul brought out the best in Fighting 17. The long months of tension and danger also contributed to a certain wildness in the squadron, making the off hours somewhat unpredictable.
I had the duty. Every so often you'd get the duty, even out in the islands. And I don't know, somebody was having a party or something, so I was having a few snorts with them, and it was, it was about secure time, 9 o'clock or so at night. And I walked in, and they were giving me hell about, what are you carrying a gun for? You couldn't hit anything if you did, and it probably isn't loaded or won't shoot, and they, abusing me pretty good. I said, the hell it is, and I whipped it out. I said, I'll show you, and I went wham, shot a bullet up. And with that, Timmy jumps up, and he says, you damn fool.
So I sneaked out of the hospital one afternoon, went over to my tent at the Strip, got a bottle of brandy, came back. That night, after lights were out, the 2 corpsmen and myself went to the nearby beach and started drinking brandy. Well, just as the evening was getting a glow on, there was an air raid. Old washing machine Charlie was doing his things, dropping a few bombs. People were running for foxholes, fires were blazing, and the air was filled with tracer bullets. It was a terrific show. So what did we do? We decided that the situation called for another drink.
We had this one guy, Skinny Ennis. There's 4 of them playing bridge, and Skinny's there. And we'd learned that if you put your, we were carrying 45s, and if you put your hand, and your hand is hard, against the end of it, you can pull the trigger and it won't fire because it's got to go all the way forward. Well, Skinny was there messing with the thing, and he took and he put in the soft part of the hand here, pulled the trigger, and pow, and went off and went right through his hand. And Roger's playing bridge there. He said, somebody take him to the dispensary, 2 spades.
I've often thought what a wonderful time of life your youth is when you feel that you will live forever, that you are immortal.
The tough, independent, and opinionated pilots had definite ideas about their chow.
It's terrible. The food is terrible. It was K rations, it was powdered eggs, it was Spam 3 times a day. It was
two pieces of bread and a big thick slice of Spam in there. And I took one bite, and I thought I was biting into a lard can. I said, these aren't sandwiches, we can't have that.
To have to eat green-looking eggs and Spam left something to be desired.
Reconstituted this, that, and the other, and our good old standby Spam, and it was horrible.
Just absolutely dreadful. We got damn near starved.
VF-17 was battering the Imperial Air Force into submission. 60 kills in 6 days. One downed enemy pilot wrote in his diary, "Here come the wolves again." He was right. The squadron had developed a very active dislike for its foe.
There's one particular fight that I'll never forget over Rabaul. We had a big melee, and I was split up, had no wingman. And normally the Japs would chase us about 20 miles offshore back toward Bougainville, and then they would pull back and go back, and once in a while we could look back and see them give their victory rolls or whatever there. Well, this time I saw one character doing that, and I was so incensed, I said, well, I'm not going to let him get away with that. So all by myself, I went back and shagged after him. I pounced him and shot him down, the plane burned, and he parachuted out. I came around in a big circle, and here's this fella coming down to shoot, and I thought to myself, well, there's one rascal that isn't going to be back up there shooting at us tomorrow. And so as I approached him, I did squeeze my triggers. However, I was going so dang fast, I didn't realize, of course, he's just in effect standing still. First of all, I damn near ran into his canopy, but I got close enough that I could look at him. And he raised an arm to me, and I did not actually hit him, but I would have if I could have. But it wasn't until about 10 seconds later that 3 of the other fellows, his friends, jumped me. And that was, I think, the really one time that I experienced real terror. Here I had them on both sides behind me, and I had 225 miles to get over water to get home. And they were making runs at me, and I was not doing much dodging because I knew I had to get acceleration, get out far enough ahead of them to get out of range of them. And we did have a slight speed advantage over them. So I kept going, but this couldn't have lasted very long, but to me it seemed like eternity before I got out. And as I usually did following a combat flight, they pulled off and went back and landed low on fuel. I took out the little canteen I had and swallowed that and then lit up a cigarette, and believe me, I never tasted anything better in my life.
Toward the latter part of the aerial opposition phase over Rabaul, we tangled into some 30 or 35 mixed zeros and hamps, and Bobby was leading the second section, and he and I worked as a team attacking these Japs from opposite sides in succession. And each of us got 4 flamers out of it. The final one I got, this lieutenant whose name I've forgotten, and I were sort of stooging around looking for trouble. And here was a lone Jap, apparently had secured for the day, and put his feet up on the dashboard and lit up a cigarette because he was flying along at about 125 knots with his canopy open, completely oblivious to what was going on. And I shot it from about 100 yards at him. I'd slowed way down, but it was very close when I shot. And the guy that was flying my wing had metallic chunks from the Japanese airplane bounce off of his wings. He saw the gouges torn by them. Well, we got home, and I was very pleased with the whole operation, which had gone well. We'd knocked down some 10 Japanese airplanes and no damage to any of ours. And I was feeling very up, and I turned to this lieutenant and said, "Boy, wasn't that a great hop?" And he says, "Skipper," he says, "I would like to be detached from Fighting 17 today. I think you people are all crazy." I said, "Okay, go pack your bag, Jack."
And it was Zoc and I alone. And we were up there at 32,000 feet, and the bombers weren't anywhere near us. We could see them way out there. So they weren't reporting any bogeys yet. And we made a couple of circles up there, and then all of a sudden the arc broke off and went into a dive, and I said, where the heck is he going? And I see a Zeke down there, but I mean way down, like maybe 5,000 feet below us. I said, this idiot, what's he doing giving up our altitude advantage going after him? And so I stayed up figuring that he'll go down and get him, and he'll come back up and join. Well, he went down and made a pass and missed him. And the guy pulled right straight up. So since he started pulling right straight up, I went right straight down. And then I cut across, you know, eventually I cut up with him, cut across, and by the time I got down there, because he's going straight up and I'm going down as hard as I can, he's going so darn slow, I said, hell, I can't give him much lead. I gave him 50 mils and shot, and it was like a ball of fire in the cockpit, just bright, bright red. So I look away and I look for Rock again, and by God, if he isn't doing the same thing, he's going right straight down. This Jap, the guy does the same damn thing, comes right straight up. This guy just went, you know, he blew up. So then I'm looking for Rock again, and I look down, and they're right on the deck. I mean, on the water. There's this Jap going along, and there's a guy right on his tail, which I had assumed was Ark, and I mean, that close to him. And this guy go that way, and Ark, and I mean, they were doing a lot of jinking and juking and everything. And here comes a Zeke coming down. I think he's coming after me. And I just jumped on his tail, and it once again just blew up. I said, what the hell am I doing down here on the water? In the harbor outside of Rabaul, their territory, all by myself, because I couldn't see Ark anywhere by this time. Well, in the meantime, I'm coming up from below, and I see this guy, and he's all alone. No, he was doing his moving out when they come out and move back in. And I just really got close to him, and I blasted away, and he just really went to pot, and I pulled back as hard as I could, but I still got stuff hitting me and oil in the windshield and everything else. And he was dead in a doornail. So there was 4 of them. After we got back home, and I was with my folks, and they said, you know, the day you got the 4, we got a call at 2 a.m. in the morning from the Herald American newspaper, and for years I couldn't tell it because I'd break up. But my mother and dad, I guess, were both going for the phone, and mom got there and said, hello. And they said, are you the parents of Dan Cunningham? I thought I had a whip. She started to faint. Dad grabs her, sets her in the chair, and by the time he gets back the phone, he says, hello, and the guy's screaming, no, 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 it's good luck, it's good luck, nothing has happened. Mother just assumed, you know, he's gone.
The day after Lieutenant Cunningham shot down 4 Zeros, Japanese planes vanished from the skies over Rabaul. It was February 20, 1944. The Jolly Roger's mission was accomplished. Total victory in the air war of the Solomons set the stage for triumph in the South Pacific. The contributions of Navy Squadron VF-17 will be long remembered.
The feeling we have for each other, I think, goes beyond ordinary friendship. It's a special relationship. It's a camaraderie which is enjoyed by men whose lives have often depended on the actions of their comrades. It's a feeling that will never be lessened by distance apart or the passage of time. It will always be that way until Father Time accomplishes what the Japanese could not do.